the first one I'm going to do is this one, which is, where do you find reliable information about the legal regulations of a foreign country on data sharing, including on data protection and copyright? So, drinks are outside. We'll be ready to go. Okay. Oh, and of course, new questions are coming up, which are not on my list. This is really hard to manage, actually. Okay. So, any thoughts on this?
I cheated slightly and sent a WhatsApp message to somebody who I thought might know, because I read these questions earlier.
Right.
So I did,
okay.
And they said that you should look on the equivalent of their government website, which seemed like a bit of a cop-out to me. I think possibly, well, although it's probably a good idea as well, I think if you can find any researchers who you know in your local institution or you pointed to who've worked within that area, that's a good start. And then possibly from there talking to institutions based within the country. They'll often have help, I guess, for their own academics and their interactions with people abroad. So that kind of information as well, possibly another, because it's in a different language, then you're a bit it's troubling. And then, yes, I guess government websites as well are a decent place to look.
So, I mean, there are 192 or something countries in the world, so it's a challenge to survey them all. There was a knowledge exchange report that was conducted in 2013, I think. Knowledge exchange is a partnership between organisations in the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark and Finland. And that surveyed those 5 countries and conducted essentially a comparison of their copyright regimes as they regarded research data and information about privacy. So that's available from the Knowledge Exchange website, which is hosted by JISC. So that's a 5-country report. That's a good starting point from a European perspective. There's also shortly to be released CODATA RDA report on, it's entitled Principles of Legal Interoperability and Implementation Guidelines. That starts from a principled point of view, sets out 6 principles which encourage the actions you can take to minimize the legal barriers to data sharing. So it's very much from that perspective. It doesn't deal a great deal with some of the more difficult issues like privacy or whatever, but it's from the point of view of how can you ensure that your data is as reusable as possible. Use an open license. And that has some material which relates to European, US legislation, and so the bibliography and the notes, the supporting documentation to that report would be a useful place to look as well.
I think actually that this leads seamlessly into another question which has come up, which is this one here, which is it the best practice in multi-nation research to follow the laws of the most strict? Well, I'll say, I mean, being risk averse and trying to and organising comparative survey projects in East and Southeast Asia, I would say yes. But only to the point at which it becomes completely restricted, where everything else shuts down. But
so in terms of managing risk, yes, there's an analogy. So the report I just mentioned about legal interoperability, that is specifically designed, or one of the use cases that is aiming to deal with is this idea of attribution stacking, or the way in which legal licenses or whatever, or if you have data from numerous sources which have different licensing regimes, then you are obliged to use the strictest, even though the data has been enmeshed and it has numerous sources. Once you've made that new integrated database with data from a given source which has a very restrictive license or restrictive legislation or control, then you are obliged to, in a sense, that restriction infects the rest of the data in the new database. So you're obliged to use that more restrictive law. Now, but there, I mean, is it best practice? I mean, it's obligatory in general research practice. Now, if you ask the question from a different perspective and say, well, what are we trying to achieve here? And from my perspective, we're trying to achieve, the European Commission's come up with a nice little dictum, as open as possible, as restricted as necessary, or something along those lines. If we're trying to achieve that, then you might want to question that a little bit.
Can I just add, there are practical implications of that. If you're publishing an article and you're reliant upon data that you've obtained from a third party who have said that you can't make it available, you have to come up with a solution that in practice allows you to share it for validation purposes, but also so that you can share it without making it completely open. And we're still trying to find out best practice in this area and an appropriate way of meeting all those requirements without annoying publishers or individual governments.
And actually, I think that can almost link in partially to this next question about storage. I mean, it's specific to the cloud here, but I think the storage of data, whether or not where this data resides, is clearly got to be critical to all of these kinds of discussions as well. So,
So in my area, some researchers take batteries out of computers, everything like that, when they go through China or Russia, because there's no trust for even what's not in the cloud. So it's also a security issue.
I don't think we should. I mean, cloud storage is one of those nebulous terms. You can talk
by
about
definition.
Exactly. It's, you can have a local cloud that meets all the requirements and that you store internally. It's essentially where that storage system is based, and does it breach any data protection or any other legal requirement. And if you have, I mean, we use a company called Rackspace quite a lot because they have ISO something number compliance.
yeah.
And we use that for clinical trials because we have a contract with them. They have appropriate security systems in place. So we don't control that system ourselves, but we rely upon that and it's trustworthy. So really it's about what kind of guarantees does the service provider offer on top of that cloud service.
Yeah, I think a lot of the suspicions about cloud services came, well, partly, as I was saying earlier, from people like myself working within institutions wanting to keep our jobs by not having all of the services you provide put out into the cloud,
Yeah.
but also by overly cautious legal representatives within universities saying, well, of course, potentially data protection, sticking to data protection. So, there was the US safe harbor, so US companies could provide you with cloud storage and they would sign up to what was called the safe harbor, which meant that they would behave as though they were bound by EU data protection law, even though they actually weren't. But that gradually fell apart, and I think around the same time as the Edward Snowden revelations, the EU decided that they were withdrawing from the safe harbor agreement. And it's those data protection issues which still lead people to feel slightly dodgy about. But then, of course, now with Brexit, we are in the same position as the US was in then.
Yeah.
We're in the position of vigorously protesting to people within Europe that they can still store their data and have us process their data. And the onus is on us to demonstrate that we still meet the requirements that they place on member nations.
Does anybody have any other technical? So that's my next question, which is now going to tee up into moving into more issues towards relation to funders and other stakeholders. But are any other technical type questions with a broad interpretation? No? Come on, there's some geeky questions here. About international standards. Okay, fair enough. All right. So moving on, do you think that research funders will eventually agree on a single standard of requirements regarding data sharing, and why? It's a nice question.
Yes.
Okay.
Really, this is where the world is going. In a lot of regimes, we're not really that far away from it in any case. There's, in terms of high-level principles, the RCUK statements and the European Commission Horizon 2020 are really not that far apart. In terms of specific applications, yes, There's different degrees of emphasis on data underpinning an article, or the amount, and if you compare with the NSF as well, there's different embargo periods, etc., etc. But that's pretty significant. That's two very significant research areas, largely covered by research data policies which have the same core set of principles. And certainly we're working very hard to try and expand the research areas which adopt those sort of principles.
Isn't the problem perhaps more at the kind of micro level between different disciplines, though? The different disciplines will have what appears to be a common language and a common set of terminology, but these can actually apply to things in quite different ways. So when people talk about raw data and process data, those can mean quite different things to people in different fields. And until you can get a system where that's really kind of explained and becomes part of the kind of culture of doing research, simply having one unified policy is not necessarily guaranteeing that everyone does things in the same way.
No, I mean, I think you have this scale from principles to policies to how it's implemented. I completely agree that the way in which particular research areas respond to principles and respond to certain language as well, what is, as you say, what is raw data, is different, and there are very different cultures in different disciplines as well. But all that said, I think we are at the beginning of a process which is one of cultural change and behavioural change and professional change. And I'm not saying for a moment that that's going to happen overnight, but it has started. We presented to a meeting of the organisation which we're part of, the International Council of Science, used to be called the International Council of Scientific Unions. So it's an umbrella body for, on the one hand, national science academies, things like the Royal Society or whatever, and the international versions of the British Chemistry Society or whatever. So the International Union of Crystallography, the International Union of Geophysics and Geodesy, etc. So we presented the Open Data in a Big Data World Accord to a meeting of those international scientific unions. And it was very notable that the room was divided, but there was a vociferous minority which was astonished that they would have to make their data available, and why. And we're the experts, we shouldn't have to justify this, we shouldn't have to provide this evidence for our assertions. People should respect that we have gone through this training, etc., and this is our considered opinion. But that was very clearly a minority. And there were some other voices in the room, equally vociferous, who said actually that might have worked in the 1960s and 70s, but it ain't the case anymore. And specifically because they were working in research areas largely biological, but not exclusively, crystallography and other areas, in which they said that their research had been incredibly advanced by the availability of data and the sharing of data and the availability of large-scale open databases, that their research had been transformed in the last 10 years. And one person in particular stood up and said, well, 10 years ago I'd have spoken just like the person who just did, but I have seen the advances that my research area has taken, with my eyes, in my professional lifetime, and the benefits are far outweigh the minor inconveniences.
Can I broaden the question slightly to cover other sharing requirements? I run our institutional data repository, and a good 75% of the people who get in touch to wanting to share data are driven by journal sharing requirements, that they have to make their data available. So journals like PLOS, for instance, require you to make data available immediately, so that it's available, or at least by the time it's published, so that it's available for any researchers who want to look at this data. But I was involved in providing feedback to another group, the International Journal of Medical Editors, and they were looking for feedback on their policy, where they were requesting comments on whether their new data sharing policy was appropriate for people working on clinical trials. And one of the requirements was data should be made available. And the vast majority of the feedback that they received was that people didn't, clinical trials didn't want to share the data immediately because they were still analysing their data and working with it. And that as a result, even things like they've had to sort of backpedal and say it should be made available within 6 months. So even things like timescales for when you share data, there's still a huge amount of disagreement within communities about when you should make it available. And until I suspect we'll see there may be greater consistency in some years, but it's going to take gradual steps over time to actually get people to the point where they are ready to be sharing resources in a standardised manner.
I mean, I agree with open data principles. Simon's talking about completely, but I guess there is some people, to play devil's advocate, some people may put forward the point that research institutions can possibly achieve a better public good by licensing that data in a restrictive manner initially to people who can commercialise it, and that would produce greater value, at least in the short term, and that's a step towards openness that maybe you want to take, keep things closed temporarily in order to, I mean, as I say, Oxford has spin-outs related to medical devices where the main asset is a data set which is used to train medical equipment, and that so I don't necessarily subscribe to that view, but I think you would find people, I think you would certainly find people who would argue to funders that they should make that an allowable use of data, that you say, make it open unless you can give us a good reason why not.
How many caveats are you going to put on this data? You're going to wonder really about the quality of the data. Is it site specific? How far can it be applied? You're going to have thousands of caveats, I should think, if you're going to say that, right, this is open to everybody, just use it, but.
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and I think that actually can links into this other question up here about data management plans, which if you're thinking about all those caveats and you've got to apply them for maybe 5 or 10 years in the future before you've even started gathering the data. So I should be chairing this, not talking, but it's an I think that the way that data that we are told to design data management plans prospectively in terms of what we're expecting to do with data that doesn't already exist in a world which is changing so rapidly, where we don't even know what the requirements are going to be of the repositories or the journals in 5 or 10 or 15 years time, or whatever the finite length of this data is.
It's also in a way that a lot of this data that you can be talking about can go back 50, 100 years. After all, time sequence data is very important. But how was that data collected 50 years ago, 100 years ago? We haven't got the same degrees of accuracy then as now.
Okay.
So I firmly believe that as researchers, scientists if you will, our innate skepticism in the philosophical sense means that we should apply a whole load of caveats to any data that we use. That's absolutely essential. And by the same token, the light of inquiry and of transparency is the best tool we have to ensure over time that the data is of sufficient quality. Keeping data under wraps just for a particular research group is the quick and easy route to mistakes, and defending mistakes on the ground of academic competition, openness in terms of data, discussion of how the data were collected, using what machines, in what circumstances, or what questionnaires, etc., is the core of scientific or research debate. And that relies upon the data being available and clearly analysable. It's a scientific principle.
Just to add to your discussion, we very often have the same question from researchers. I've spent ages analysing this data and now I don't want to share it because I want to have 5 more papers or God knows how many. And that's something that we receive with quite a high degree of frustration, because I absolutely agree with you, Simon, on what we tell researchers, that publications without the supporting evidence is just a claim. So if you don't want to make the claim, if you're not ready to make your claim because you're not ready to release the data, then just don't publish it. No, how can you just go ahead and publish your paper, make a claim, if you're not allowing others to, to make sure that your claim is actually valid? So I absolutely agree with you. We're trying to push back on this kind of attitude.
Yeah. So I skipped over a slide in my presentation which had sort of 3 layers of data, and it really relates to the guidance in the Horizon 2020 policy and in other policies, that you can roughly make a sort of typology of 3 types of data. So one is the large exercise of data collection which underpin many research areas, so whether that's Earth observation or temperatures or groundwater or whatever. This is, or statistics, household surveys, whatever. Data collection exercises which are necessary for a whole load of research projects, and so that data has to be accessible. Sometimes it has to be purchased because that's the funding model for the collection, but that sort of core data gathering. Then in the context of funded research projects, whether that's a long-term research centre or a short-term project, by and large there are two types of data. There's the data specifically that underpins the research article. Now, that has to be released, in my view, immediately, concurrently with the research article, because that's the evidence. However, many projects, let's say microscopy, a microscopy project will make lots and lots and lots and lots of images. Not all of those will directly underpin the article, but they may be used in further research. I'm pretty sanguine and minded to be fairly tolerant about a short-term embargo. But it has to be short-term, it has to be specific, and it has to be monitored. Because there's a significant investment in the creation of those data that can be used by other people. But I don't really want, a year, 6 months, a year. Some of the marine research policies in the US have 2 years. That strikes me as a little bit excessive. But privileged access for a limited period of time seems appropriate, but no more.
What do you then say to a researcher who says, as I've heard researchers say, but it takes more than 2 years to get into print of the discipline? They go through the peer review process and so forth. I mean, I've heard that from researchers. They say, you want me to release my data within a year, but it's going to take 2 years from my publication to get into the public sphere. What do we say?
Well, I think there are issues with the speed of publication and and the locus of publication, but the work has been done. The data is a valuable asset for other researchers, and I don't think for the research community as a whole. And I'll let you come in a moment. The other thing is publish the data. Publish the data in a usable form and get it cited. The point that I made in the talk about data citation. This is as valuable an output as your interpretive article. The culture needs to change in order to recognise that, but in the meantime, publish the data. Make sure that it's a very well annotated, highly reusable data set, and it will be reused, and you'll get credit for it.
So just to comment on this, we have the same questions again, and what we would very often tell researchers that if somebody else would want to get hold of this data and go through the same peer review process in the same discipline, because I guess it's usually the same type of data set, the same type of journals you would have published, would go for exactly the same lengthy process. So the researcher who publishes the data usually already has advantage because they started putting the paper together. Another thing that we are trying to suggest to people, I'm not saying that it always works. You have some people who just turn their backs on you, but let's spread the word. Sometimes what we suggest to them to put a statement when they share the data, make additional description. I'm happy to collaborate with you, and that's sometimes something that encourages them, because if you are that researcher who is to reuse that data set, no matter how well the data is described, it will always take you some time to understand the data, to ingest the data, to look into data. So if you can have somebody who is willing to collaborate with you and guide you, pinpoint you to interesting stuff in the data, sometimes it can be mutually beneficial for both parties, on top of getting the citations of the data set, of course. But we sort of try to perceive it, as another way for you to attract more collaboration with your data set. It doesn't always work, but that's something that we're trying to advocate as hard as we can.
I guess it's how we drive that change of culture to make data recognised, because at the moment that's not what researchers are perceiving themselves as getting the most credit for. That's a big problem.
And I think there's also an issue of ownership. I mean, it's this. I mean, I completely sympathise with this idea. I mean, and I would feel the same. That I have gone through a tremendous amount of, I won't swear, difficulty getting together a lot of qualitative data in China, for example. And I've got it all organised. I've got it interviewed. I've got the interviews done. I've got the transcriptions done. I've got the analysis done. And I write my article, and then it's gone. That data is now free to anybody to use. And the thing is, though, is that if I was better organised, I would get all of my analysis done that I wanted to do and exhaust it as far as I could do, and then submit them all, and then submit the data. But I'm just not organised enough to do that. And there's a difficulty about, well, where's the end point? Where am I going to stop? How am I going to bleed this thing out? And then, of course, somebody else is going to come along and find something more interesting. But on a more fundamental level, the thing I have to keep telling myself is that this data is not mine. It's a public, I think you think of it as a public good. It was paid for by the public. All I've done is translated public money into a good, which then belongs back in the public realm. But I'm on the far side of openness. I think I would hope at least. So I think, but it is a very difficult thing because it's precious to you, that you've got this thing, and also my code's terrible as well. So I am embarrassed about sharing my code. It's just a mess. But all social sciences are terrible at writing code. So sorry about that. Okay, I think let's move on. I've got one interesting last question here, which actually Julian might want to say something about as well. I don't know why you're not on the panel. I'm sorry. You can come up here if you want. Which I think is we've talked a little bit about already about this research industry and this notion of the ethics of I'll just read it now. What about ethics of international researchers working with NGOs where data collected by researchers using NGO resources, but the NGO can't then access them? I mean, to a certain degree, of course, if we had an open data system, then issues like that might disappear. But I mean, Julie, what do you think about that?
I think it's difficult because it really depends on the nature of the data. And I think it's one thing if you talk about quantitative data and temperature measures or whatever, but if you actually talk about very private experiences that people share with you because they trust you, I think it's very difficult to say yes, this should be open to everyone, can be reused, because I think it's more a breath of the trust, because this person trusts you to handle this data in a very sensitive way. So, and I would disagree with this ownership thing, because I don't think the ownership lies with the funder, but actually with the person who has shared all that, because it's his or her experience. But when it comes to that, I think there should be probably guidelines and expectations should be formulated in the very beginning of the research, so that an NGO actually feels that they are in a driving position and can actually say, okay, we enable you access, but in return we will get some of your data, or you will share that, or you will present it, or something like that. And I think it's a responsibility, especially for researchers from the global north, to actually make sure that these NGOs feel in that position to be able to ask for sharing the data that is collected.
So just working in developing countries, the researchers we work with, even institutes or parts of the government, often don't have access to academic research. So we if anything they want to get, like academic articles, we try and share with them and use our access to share it. Because even though there's lots of deals, discounted prices or things like that, it often gets stuck in maybe at a university or one office, but it doesn't diffuse through a society very well. So I think just a more informal arrangement is one way to try and communicate things that are wanted by locals.
So again, I like the European Commission's dictum, as open as possible, as restricted as necessary. So take the steps, partly of which have been alluded to, make sure that there's the greatest degree of consent possible, the greatest degree of anonymization as possible. Also, use restricted access for the stakeholders in that study, including the NGO. I mean, I think it's an absolute travesty if the NGO can't, under restricted, controlled, securitized circumstances, access the database. That would be a travesty. But those arrangements can be made. And those arrangements should be made. It depends upon the nature of the data. If it's that sort of intensely personal qualitative data, then yes, there are good reasons for restricting it. But the NGO may very well have a strong case for being allowed restricted access to those data, as well as to the end report. So don't, it's never completely black and white. But I think we have to do the most we can to make the data as reusable as possible in order to extract the maximum value in human and research terms from the data, from the investment that's been made in it, as you said yourself, that public investment. There are things that can be done. It's not just completely open or completely closed.
Not wanting to be over literal about the point you made about the ownership of the people who are giving this testimony. I mean, unless you handle it in your consent form, it is their property, legally speaking. If you're recording their words, you have, a mechanical copyright in the recording, but unless you take a license from them or ask them to assign the rights to it to you, then they are the owners and they are part of the group of people who are making that data open if it's made open. And so that needs to be obviously extremely well-informed consent.
And the same can be applied to collaborators in any study if they're contributing something, then you should write it down what they're contributing, what they expect back. We have great trouble in our university with people actually doing consortium agreements because they know each other on a personal level and they don't see the need for a legal document until they fall out 3 years later and when they start to disagree. So having something in writing up front that says this is what we expect is incredibly useful.
And also when you're talking about layers of reuse, at some point somebody's going to say, well, I know that there was some kind of gentleman's agreement over this or gentleperson's agreement over this at the beginning, but we really need a proper paper trail of who owns this data and this gap in it, which represents the point at which you two said we're going to share this, but we're not going to document the means by which we've done it. It becomes a real problem for reuse down the line, especially if you're not available to attest to it and the person who's agreed with you isn't available to attest to it.
No, I think that this issue of ownership, I think is interesting and important, and the idea that, and as with all these things, it's difficult to know where that line is going to be drawn. I mean, you can understand that if you're talking about, the experience of genocide in Rwanda, and being able to obtain that information, the trust that is going to be required. But then, having said that, if I'm in Kurdistan just talking to people about when they were born, where they were born, even though this is just a tick in a box or a number, the trust that you have to develop and also the way that information can be used and abused by other people. It might be an NGO accessing this, if it's a government either in Iraq or Rwanda or a group or some other, so the wrong people getting hold of this. So it's a real, and you can plan for some of this in your ethics guidelines, you can plan for some of this in your consent form, you can plan for some of this in your data management plan, but the difficulty of seeing that through, I think it's highly complex, I think.
I think the risks are obviously much greater with small n qualitative studies than with large n, because with qualitative work, there's a real tension between the thick description that you give in order to give nuance and context and meaning and anonymity. So you create a situation where you promise people anonymity, but then you describe them and their context in so much detail that they're easily recognisable. And there's been quite a number of famous cases of this kind of unfolding in a very bad way. One of the most famous ones was Nancy Shepherd-Hughes' book, Saints, Scholars and Schizophrenics, which I don't know if people are familiar with, but she was a Berkeley anthropologist who followed up on some data that seemed to signify higher rates of schizophrenia in rural Ireland. And she went to a village in rural Ireland and she spent maybe over a year there, and she wrote a book about it, and in the book she made some inferences about single adult siblings living together. And without saying the word incest, she inferred it, and was relating this to issues to do with mental health. And the Irish press got hold of it, and even though she'd anonymised the individuals in the village, they were in the village within 24 hours because of the thick description, and that unfolded very badly for everybody. And there's been quite a few examples of that as well. So I think so in some ways with qualitative work, the issue of making your data public is differently complex, because as soon as you start to publish your analysis, there's generally so much of the data in there already that you're already making it public, albeit it may be your interpretation of it, but nevertheless it's still there in a way in which others can be identified. So it's not just about giving your raw field notes or your annotated interview data and making that available. It's also sort of transcends into the publication phase as well.
And I think that a lot of journals, particularly mixed methods, are not, they are set up for, it's one thing to produce code, but to send in your in vivo understanding, of your interpretations of the data and all of the data and how that was going to, the interpretation in that is going to be a completely different setup to just clicking a button, running it in R and getting the same thing, spat out at you at the end. But again, we have a one-size-fits-all often, plan for designing these kinds of things. Anyway, sorry, I'm going to stop rattling on.
Comment. I've done quite a bit of work with NGOs overseas, both international and local, especially people like WaterAid. And I find it's always worthwhile to set up a contract between you and them at the outset. They're damn good at facilitating things like accommodation, transport, to be met at the airport, facilitating meetings with local government officers and national government officers, which frees you up a hell of a lot. I think it's only right that you should present them a copy of any final report or any interim reports that are produced during the project, and also provide them with a copy of all data collected and associated data, as was suggested in PDF format with journal papers that are relevant to the project. They're going to be there for a hell of a long time after you've left. They need that information. That's the big thing, is that you've just helped them for a bit. If you want capacity building, you leave the data, you show them how to do it, how to collect it. If you don't leave them the data, they don't know what they're looking at.
It seems, ever since June the 23rd, I don't think I've sat in any room within this university without somebody using that B word. So I don't like to break with convention. I'm a pretty standard kind of guy. So here we are. Hashtag Brexit. What effects will Brexit have? I don't even know what Brexit is. On international, it means Brexit. I know it means that, but I don't know what that really means. What means. So, what effects will Brexit, hard or soft, have on international data sharing agreements? Go on, give it a go. I just think. I don't know. What do you think? Okay. What would be the? Okay, let's think about some extremes or some possible scenarios.
Well, potentially data couldn't be shared with people from EU data couldn't be shared with people, academics within the UK, if we derogate completely from all data protection responsibilities and say this is what we need to do. If we adopt a US approach of saying, a kind of Wild West reuse of health data, if you can get your hands on it, it's yours, do what you like with it, approach is going to be great for our economy. It's going to make our insurers richer. It's going to be, there are all sorts of reasons you can put forward why it's a good idea. That will make it very hard to come up with data sharing agreements as part of academic collaborations that will hold water. But you're right. I mean, it's impossible to answer the question because we don't know what the settlement is.
Mm. But the extent, I mean, I'm just curious the extent to which I know that Messrs. Fox, Johnson, and Davis have got perhaps more important things on their plate. But these are this is where I think it's the nuts and bolts of these. They don't care about this. I'm sure they just don't care about this. But at some point, somebody's got to care about this because somebody's actually got to make a decision on these kinds of things. And I think it's I don't know the roles which universities, which funders, which researchers are actually playing in saying, don't forget about this kind of stuff because this will matter. This will matter a lot. I should hop down from my bandwagon there. Okay, so that didn't fly very well. Okay. You know what? We've got 7 minutes left. And so look at that. That's a nice question on there. I presume this means about data collection and management rather than, don't get married, have children in 20s, etc., etc.
So something we used to say a lot in the GISC program that I ran was the first person that you share your data with is your future self. And there's a nice XKCD cartoon which makes the same point, that good annotation, good data description is just good research method.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you learn to be more thorough quickly.
Yeah.
Who's not been there looking at a table that they created, or whatever thing. What? Who was that person? When was this interview done? Whatever.
Quick and dirty does not.
So,
yeah.
Good annotation. Remember, you will forget, and the sort of things that allow you to understand your data of whatever sort in the future allow other people to understand that. So it's just good data management.
To reference another XKCD cartoon. Before trying to reinvent the wheel, make sure you're aware of all the other standards that have been developed in the same area and see if you can actually apply them.
I think from a data collection point of view, you just invest in languages from a really early age because you really never know what parts of the world you're going to end up in, and just developing really strong language skills, because we talked about using translators, and nothing compares with actually being able to converse with people in their own language.
Make sure your encryption tools are legal in the country you're visiting.
I wish my dad gave me this kind of advice. I was banged up in Erbil there. No, right, okay. Any more? I'll find another last. Let's see if I can find one last one. This is a rather existential question, which means that perhaps a rather existential question. Are the problems of moving data across borders exaggerated? Yes. No.
Are there any lawyers?
I'm sure social sciences added, well, yeah, bit of this, bit of that, maybe on weekends and bank holidays.
In a way, it's freed up because it can be emailed, it can USB or whatever. A lot of more physical data is easy to transport now.
So it depends what we mean by moving data across borders. There's an ethical issue about conducting research in lower and middle income countries in the global south, or what you will, and not making that data available for those countries. There are many instances of that, and it's tantamount to data imperialism, data colonialism, or whatever. And if that's included in our scope of taking data across borders, then the challenges or the problems aren't exaggerated. That's something that we encounter a lot in the work we're doing, or issues around that, and it has in my view, a negative impact upon the attitudes towards open data, open sharing in the countries in which we're working, which unfortunately I think has an overall negative effect on the way in which the science system can develop.
Mhm.